So I would like to kick off our final discussion of the day by introducing Luis Lozada to the stage. Luis is the CEO of Democracy Works, an innovative technology nonprofit working to ensure every citizen has the information they need to participate in our elections. Luis is also passionate about the critical need for investment in long-term infrastructure, what we just heard Manu advising us to think about, to ensure the resilience of our democracy and our civic life. That's why I've asked him to facilitate this critical conversation about the role of social and civic infrastructure in resilience, especially at challenging times. Please welcome Luis Lozada.
I brought some friends with me. Good afternoon, everyone. The four of us understand that we are what keeps you from a beer, maybe in the rain, so we'll try to move this along and keep it interesting. As Cam mentioned, I'm Luis Lozada. I'm the CEO of Democracy Works. For over 15 years, we've been building civic infrastructure that millions of Americans rely on to vote, the election data that powers Google search, Facebook, TikTok, and hundreds of civic organizations, nonprofits, and higher education institutions. And we're able to do this because we exist in community with election officials. We've learned that when civic infrastructure works well, it's invisible, kind of like the bridge you drive over every day and don't notice it's out until it's actually out. And our mission is to empower voters to participate in every election. Today's topic considers the 2025 wildfires and floods remind us that infrastructure is more than roads and power lines. It's also the civic and social systems that keep communities engaged and informed in crisis. Social infrastructure means strong local organizations, trusted civic networks, and accessible informations, things that make resilience possible. The question is not whether we invest, as Manu eloquently put it, but how do we do it smartly and sustainably? Moderator's privilege here. I exist in this community of folks that do democracy work, no pun intended. And a lot of familiar faces out here in the crowd. I travel in circles at other sorts of convenings such as this. And when I'm in this community, I feel very safe talking about the work that I do, the challenges that exist in this country, without fear of any retribution or reprisal. And I always feel willing to either offer help or ask for help. Because at this moment in time, when you're doing democracy work and civic work, you could use a helping hand. And it takes me back to very early on in my life. I grew up in the projects in New York City. And for some reason, my mother constantly was out of sugar or coffee. And she'd ask me to knock on a neighbor's door to ask for either of those items. And man, that's embarrassing. I mean, I'm already living in the projects, and you're going to get me to knock on people's doors to ask for random groceries? But never once did anyone turn me away. And when I think about that, I was like, that's a pretty resilient community. I had to show myself, I had to show up authentically, even though I was embarrassed. But nobody turned me away. And I fast forward, I now live in Florida, and I live in a house with an HOA, and I'm the president, goodness. And,
condolences.
Last week I was at a neighbor's house, week 1 of the NFL season, and there were some folks that I didn't know, and somebody asked the dreaded question for me: what do you do for work? And I usually default in unsafe spaces to, I'm a lawyer. Now, I actually am a lawyer, and that's what I did before we started doing this type of work, but it can usually shut down the conversation pretty quickly. But boy, I made the mistake of saying, democracy and supporting elections, and immediately, what party are you? I'm like, oh, here we go. And in Florida, your party affiliation is public record because it's a close primary state, et cetera, et cetera. I was like, they're going to be able to look me up, so I might as well not run for it. And I said, well, I am registered to vote in Democratic primaries. did you know that the last 4 letters in Republican are I can, but the last 3 letters in Democrat are rat? You're okay with being a rat? And I said, well, I really just like voting in Democratic primaries because I needed to find a way to get out of that conversation. I now know where it is unlikely that I will ever have to ask for sugar or coffee again, but I won't feel comfortable borrowing that ladder. Or later this fall when hurricane season comes in earnest and I've got to take down, whether it's the outdoor TV or something, and I need some help, I know which door not to knock on. And that's an indictment. That's an indictment of the lack of community that might exist in many areas of the country. So we're going to talk about social infrastructure, and we're going to talk about the great work that's being done by the panelists on this stage at their respective organizations, and how there are organizations that are really willing to lean in to help build social infrastructure. But as we enter the conversation, I want to make sure I inject that element, that there's this person-to-person component. And how do we feel about asking our neighbor for help? Because whether it's a hurricane or a fire or an earthquake or a flood, you're going to be most proximate to the person that lives right next to you. And what are we doing? How are we thinking about that particular challenge? To my left, in the middle, we start with Tara Roth, who's the president of the Gold-Hirsch Foundation, a 100% mission-aligned foundation that supports innovation via its financial, human, and social capital. Tara oversees all aspects of the foundation, including assisting with sourcing and vetting investments that aim to advance human life and well-being and catalyze human potential. Last year, the foundation named a new all-female investment committee, believed to be the first at an organization of its size and scope. And under Tara's leadership, the Gold-Hirsch Foundation spearheads LA 2050, a community-guided initiative creating a shared vision for LA's future. At the far end of the stage, Nick Dechugivsky, Senior Program Officer at the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation. Nick has been working in philanthropy for over 35 years with a particular focus on supporting causes that build communities outside of the United States. And finally, closest to me is Mike Carney, President of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation. And Mike's work focuses on innovative solutions for wicked problems. And he does it across veterans issues, disaster recovery, workforce development, and civics. Again, I did some grounding here. The event is really about community resilience. We're going to keep that in the back of our mind. But there's some high-level perspectives from each of our panelists that I want to make sure that we surface. I'm going to start with you, Tara. Can you talk about the LA 2050 initiative and how your organization has built community around resiliency after the wildfires in Los Angeles earlier this year? And before you launch into that, I know that you were personally affected by the fires, and we're obviously sorry for the loss and the experience that you underwent, and appreciate the personal dimension that you bring to this work.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Yes, there's an article about my evacuation in Rolling Stone. I never thought that would be my inaugural article in Rolling Stone, so I'm sort of the fire rock star. So because I had COVID and was asleep during the evacuation when all of the text alerts came in and emails, and I had undiagnosed COVID, so I went outside in my pajamas and the fireman said, "Get out of here now." So I left with my phone and my computer. I got into my car. I wound up abandoning my car because the palm trees in the median of the road ignited and I was surrounded by fire. And actually it was my neighbor who found me on Sunset Boulevard in Los Angeles later and gave me a ride. But what I will say is that I then proceeded to live among 6 different friends' houses with my 14-year-old son and have just moved back to the Palisades. But just some of the personal perspective, because I'd never been in an experience like this, is when I first tried going back to my home to see if my home was actually there and to see if my car was there or if it had been bulldozed away. It was a very surreal experience. There were MASH-like tents on the beach next to the country clubs. There were like 50 tanks I had to go through multiple guard stations with machine guns. I had to show permits. We needed police escort. And so a lot of the social infrastructure was very apparent and very present. There were volunteers giving us hot meals while we waited in line. There were curfews implemented. People were always trying to be kind. I relied on a lot of kindness of a lot of strangers and friends during that time. And I'm now back, and I live in a house that stands. Most of the houses around me are standing. But what I've realized is that it's not just the houses that have burned down, it's the entire ecosystem of human connection. And I would say that now versus moving around every 6 months has been the most challenging part of this experience for me, because it feels very, very isolating and very alone. There are no parks, no libraries, no grocery stores, no post offices, no dry cleaners, no farmers markets. Even walking to the beach, which I used to do, is a very it's a very humbling and heavy endeavor, because you just see the destruction and the devastation. It's like being in a little bit of a war zone. So these places where infrastructure happens are no longer there. And I think that that's what's really important, is because the social infrastructure is like the invisible connective tissue of civic health. And when the physical infrastructure is gone, that social tissue becomes all the more important, and it's also harder to access. So going to my organization, LA 2050, when the wildfires hit Los Angeles, we were reminded that resilience is not just built in a moment of crisis, it's built decades prior. I think this is the theme that we've been reiterating this conference. And we'd been weaving the social fabric of trust in LA 2050 for more than a decade. So when I went to bed for 2 weeks with really bad COVID, my team did something. They pulled together a volunteer guide and resource guide about how people could help, because we were getting flooded with thousands of requests all over the United States about how to help. I think I alone got 300 text messages, and that, when you're really sick and displaced and multiple, it was very challenging, but I also felt the love. So our team did this volunteer guide, and we had what I'm calling our Ariana Grande moment. And that's when Ariana Grande got hold of our guide and reposted it. And the thing went viral, and we had more than 2.2 million people view our guide. So that's the power of celebrity, but also of trusted networks, that one post can have outsized impact. And one of the issues was not just that we had Ariana Grande posting, but that we had also built credibility, and we were sourcing content from the communities we serve in an authentic, trusted, accessible way, in ways in which we'd built those relationships for years. So that was one other thing. And then when other foundations rushed in to provide emergency funding, which I was so grateful for their doing, we took a step back and we thought about infrastructure, and we thought about how can we be of service. And so we integrated wildfire into our LA 2050 grants cycle, and to keep it in the regular cycle. So we had 1,200 applications submitted for our LA 2050 grants program. Of that, we had a survey about how communities were pivoting to work on wildfire recovery. We had 1 in 4 of the applicants answer the survey, and then 1 in 8 determined that they wanted to apply for funding specifically for wildfire recovery. And what struck me was that those numbers were actually quite low, given the proximity of time to the fires. But what we learned was that the fires really impacted every aspect of these organizations' work, that recovery touches everything from housing to cultural healing to food access to education, and that resilience isn't sectoral, it's really systemic. So the hard truth also is that disaster preparedness, when we poll Angelenos about what they want every year and what matters most to them, it always polls last. And even this year with the fire, it polled last. So we as funders need to think about how we can build social infrastructure to integrate that resiliency in communities throughout. Because when people are not thinking about prevention when they're just trying to survive. So there are some real tools that we can use for supporting civic health.
Absolutely. Just trying to survive. When you need some sugar and some coffee, you're really not thinking about these high-minded issues. Nick, I understand that the Mott Foundation has a long history of supporting civil society infrastructure, both in the U.S. and abroad. Can you explain the Mott Foundation's motivation for infrastructure investments and what are some of the specific investments being made and how that work is evolving?
Yeah, sure. Let me kind of start with a little bit of history as I learned it. Even though I've been at the Mott Foundation for 25 years now, but it was a while before that. And I won't get into the different concepts of civil society, of nonprofit sector, of philanthropy, but history, as I learned it, was that there was this thing called the 1969 Tax Act, which shifted the way foundations could operate. And in fact, our founder, Charles Stewart Mott, was at a congressional hearing about that, because there was a lack of understanding how foundations work. They're communist or promoting this agenda or that. And there was a realization on the part of our founder that foundations or philanthropy should get together to speak with a particular voice to try to ensure that there is a healthy policy environment for philanthropy and what it can do. Now, over time, that extended to the understanding that it goes beyond just foundations themselves, but to the organizations they support, nonprofit organizations. And I might argue that once we started funding more things abroad in the 1990s, it kind of went even a little bit broader with the civil society concept. So, and in the 1990s, we started supporting work on shifting from apartheid in South Africa. That was one sort of geographical locus. Another one was the former Soviet Union coming apart and opportunities for supporting the transition to democracy that some were able to manage and many, unfortunately, have not. But in any case, that opened this perspective of a nonprofit sector or an independent sector, and a portion of that was sort of more on the micro level of helping individual NGOs, as we like to call them. Here in the U.S., we'll say nonprofits. Other countries will say voluntary or charitable or however. But supporting them in their capacity, how do they do their work, how they're governed, lawyers and accountants, and to support their, how they do their work. But a realization that you really have to pay attention to what we like to call the enabling environment for where they do their work, so that they're enabled. What's the legal and fiscal framework that could do that work? So let me say that played a big role in our thinking of saying, okay, there are organizations which have more narrow missions, housing, culture, education, children, youth, environment, but the sector that ends up doing this work between government and the private sector, the civil society sector, something has to take care of it being able to do what it does well, and hopefully always striving to improve, that cares about the sector more broadly. So that's kind of the gist of it, and we've been doing that for decades, supporting that. How some things have shifted is that starting around the mid-2000s, the expansion of, if you look at Freedom House indexes or Civicus's Civicus Monitor, there was a period where there seemed to democracy and freedom was expanding around the world, and then it started going the other way, right? We were sharing best practices, and the other side was sharing their best practices on how to start countering that. And we are unfortunately living in a period where around the globe, the space for civil society to operate is narrowing, and we're now starting to see that more and more even in our own country. So our work to support kind of the sector is also kind of shifting a little bit more towards saying, well, how do we protect civic space? How do we defend this? In fact, we've just had a new program plan in renaming the work where we're actually calling it protection of the sector, right? Because the threats are real. So that's in a nutshell on infrastructure. I'll be happy to say a little bit more about it, especially say what we do on community level, but I'll leave that for maybe more.
Sure. In the scope of community resilience, I think it's also important to consider the role of business and organizations like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation, where small business owners can often be a strong backbone for communities in crisis. Mike, can you share some more details on how the Chamber's Foundation supports community resilience after disasters and any relevant examples that you might have?
Yeah, and thank you for the opportunity. You know, we think that civic health, well, we believe that civic health is a critical part of economic health and vice versa. So, you know, when disaster strikes, whether it's the wildfires in Southern California or the floods in the hill country of Texas or a war in Ukraine, one of the things that helps determine whether or how well the community can get through that is the capacity of the private sector in that area. So we spend a lot of time both trying to make sure that communities, and particularly small businesses that tend to be under, you know, less resourced than larger firms, have the ability to withstand the unexpected. We have a program, Readiness for Resilience, that if you're a small business owner and you go through a checklist and a disaster strikes, you're immediately eligible for a $5,000 grant that has been endowed by Federal Express and others. Hard part is getting small businesses to work through that checklist, because for most of them, the same person is the CEO, the person manning the front desk, the HR manager, the person who does the books. Like, all of this is one thing, and it's hard to prioritize resilience. So oftentimes what happens, like we saw this especially after Hurricanes Helene and Milton, you have these unexpected catastrophes, and the small business owner is also the resident who's been displaced. Mm-hmm. And it is absolutely essential that we get some of these critical lifelines back, because, you know, they are enabling the recovery. You know, the person who owns the gas station, if they're not able to get their doors open, they're not able to give you gas to either get off the mountain, as happened to my in-laws in Western North Carolina, or to help people who are coming in get gas so they can get deeper into the disaster zone. So when there's a particularly significant disaster, like in Maui, what we do is we go out and we ask companies to, if they're able to, larger companies, if they're able to kick in to support smaller businesses so they can get back up and running. And what we find is that this is really important, because you don't have a lot of options. You know, we find that, you know, usually it's about a $5,000 grant, which in Washington, I mean, that's not even a rounding error, right? Everybody talks about it in billions. But if you're running a small business, $5,000 in a disaster means that you can pay your employees or pay your rent or do something. And what we see is that the small businesses, like if you look at Hendersonville, North Carolina, it was the small businesses that were setting up, or the little restaurants that were setting up the food for the responders and for the people who's, you know, had no electricity or no heat. So we think that small businesses are a critical part of community resilience, and we are spending a lot of time trying to make sure that they are resilient on the front end, but then also able to get through and recover on the back end.
I think that makes sense. During our prep, you talked about Maui and the fires in Maui, and I wanted to extend this to an exploration of whether the civic health of a particular city community correlates to its ability to be resilient. And I think you remember the Maui story about how they couldn't find a quorum.
Yeah.
But can each of you share your thoughts, again, on the connection between civic health, the state of a country, of a locality, and its ability to be resilient in the time of a disaster? I'll start with you because of Maui.
Yeah. So I think it was August of 2023, devastating wildfires in Maui, and they tore through Lahaina, which very kind of small business centric, right on the water, but also the residential area where thousands of people lived, and mostly, the folks who relied on tourism for their livelihoods. Their houses were all gone. We worked with the American Express Foundation to stand up a grant program for the small businesses that included kind of consulting and coaching so that they could adjust, because it was going to be quite a while before they were able to get back to their bricks and mortar. But even businesses that were not directly impacted by the fire were hurt, because one of the messages that occurred, this happens a lot, understandably, people say, well, we don't want to overload the local capacity, so we're not going to go there as tourists. And we all mean well when we do that, but that's the economy. So we end up strangling all the other small businesses and big businesses in the area. So we were helping coach them, and we had experts trying to, like, how to adjust your business. Like, there was one guy, his business was having local musicians go perform at the resorts. Well, if there are no tourists, there's no need for that. So we helped them all, hundreds of these folks adjust. I went out there, and what I was struck by was, so this was a year after the fires, and it was still a disaster zone. Nothing had been rebuilt. And I was talking to one of the local business owners about why they were having so much trouble getting things moving. And he said, well, one of the challenges is that our commissions are having trouble making quorum. And you don't think about this, right? But those are tough jobs. You want to be on the zoning commission and have people yell at you, or the planning commission and have people yell at you. You're a volunteer. You're giving up your time. Well, after a disaster, you've probably been displaced. There probably weren't enough people on the commission to begin with. And now the workload is astronomical, because you're basically, you have to go deal with thousands of people. So that slows down the recovery. And because of the way our systems are designed, we don't often have easy ways to adjust in a crisis. And we see this kind of thing happen all the time. If you can't make quorum, you can't make a decision. If you can't make a decision, you can't recover. If you can't recover, more people the economy's hurting, the people are hurting, and it's just this vicious cycle. So civic infrastructure is a critical part of resilience. It's also a really important economic enabler.
Others on the connection between the civic health of a particular location and its ability to be resilient in the face of, crisis or disaster.
Well, I'll say that I've been very impressed with Los Angeles and the response that Angelinos have had. And I always say that LA is where the future comes to happen, because it really is at kind of the bleeding edge of innovation and creativity. And we do also tend to be, we were talking about your democracy in Florida, we tend to be a little homogeneous in Los Angeles in terms of political beliefs. It's actually hard to find someone with whom to have a political discourse and disagree, oftentimes. But, I think my mic just, no, it's gone, it's on. So, but I've been really impressed, partly because LA is such a diverse place. It's 88 cities in this county. We are racially and economically diverse. And then also the responses to the wildfires, of which I've been a part of a lot of the different discussions, have been very cross-sector and very, very collaborative. So I'm in probably 6 different wildfire recovery organizations and collectives that involve think tanks, that involve brands, that involve philanthropy, that involve consulting groups, real estate developers, and that also have sourced from experts and community members. There have been so many different organizations that have been stood up to really get the voice of like what's happening to people on the ground in the community, and then what are the experts saying. And there are different organizations who've taken on research about the quality of the soil health, for instance, or how to navigate through resources. UCLA set up a disaster recovery center where they had faith-based organizations handing out blankets and unconditional cash loans to people, where also FEMA was providing you assistance with how to register and how to get assistance with FEMA. And so I've really been thrilled with seeing how the different sectors and different people of Los Angeles have come together as Angelinos, and I believe that that is going to help with expedite the recovery and then help with the rebuilding in a way that's intentional and that also retains attributes to the respective communities that have been impacted.
Sure. I think we're talking about alignment here and getting all these different stakeholders on the same page on the needs of the moment. Nick or any others, you've got philanthropy, you've got government, civil society, the private sector, each have a role, and no single funder is going to be able to come in and save us from catastrophe. What are some examples that you've seen, especially over the last 5 years? Because I think that whether it's my example from 40 years ago, I think there's been some movement in the ability or lack thereof to actually coordinate across sector lines, political lines, all that. But if you've gotten a good example over the recent past where you've seen effective coordination between different stakeholders after a disaster.
So thank you for the question. Let me go with a few vignettes, one from a city to a country to a neighborhood in that country. And it might be a little bit, I'll extend beyond the 5 years. So the city is Flint, Michigan, right? And the crisis was the water crisis. And that needed a very, and of course, I assume everybody's aware of it. Lead was found in the drinking water in Flint and the like, and there was a pretty quick response needed to switch the water supply back from the Flint River to the Detroit water supply. And then there was actually responding to the crisis of providing the supports needed for children who unfortunately their health was affected by it. So there are a few more, but there were like 4 big dogs, you might say, that were like funding agencies in Flint that were private. That was us, the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation. There's a Ruth Mott Foundation, which works just in Flint. There was the Community Foundation for Greater Flint, and then there was the United Way. And those 4, particularly the United Way and the Community Foundation, were really like working so closely together, saying, you know these people better. You know that neighborhood better. Here's what you can deliver. Here's what we can deliver. And along in consultation with the others. But that didn't happen just on its own. There had been work to have nonprofit capacity building where those 4 organizations supported together. And so, different ones had different connections to the private sector, right? Probably our CEO had more of connections than some of the others, or to the mayor's office, or to the county, to the state, to environmental nonprofits and the like, and to other funders, because a lot of funding was raised in the generosity of people from around the country as well. But that also had to do with the fact that, or other foundations, that our leadership was in touch with a bunch of others through organizations like the Council on Foundations or the Council on Michigan Foundation. So these things, those relationships were very important. So that's the city level. Country, Ukraine. You mentioned the war in Ukraine, Mark. Appreciate that. I'm of Ukrainian descent, so I follow it closely. But over the years, what happened, because I used to work there in the 1990s, right after independence, where practically speaking, the civic infrastructure was whatever the party said or the government said, and that's very top-down was supposed to do. And many funders, including us, were working on developing a sector where people said, what we do matters, let's connect, let's do things collectively without waiting for orders from somebody else to say, here's what you're supposed to do. And that built in cycles. You saw there was the Orange Revolution in 2004. A lot of organizations kind of learned and then spent time doing things together. Then fast forward another 10 years in 2014, the Revolution of Dignitary. There was more mutual support in ways that organizations, civic organizations, knew how to coordinate with each other. And while right now it is an existential question because there is a genocidal imperialist imperialist invader that's actually killing people, civilians and everything. But so sometimes that will really motivate you to stick together. But the civic muscle that has been built up over a couple decades really came into play that has shown the resilience of the Ukrainian people now to be able to try to fend off this threat. And I'll head back to, bringing it down to the local level. So my brother-in-law, on the first days of when Kiev was they were like right on the edge of Kiev, and then the Russians got beat back, but they were forming territorial defense units, and the fact that he knew pretty much everybody in his little neighborhood, 10, 15 block area, because he'd be going out and walking his dog, and he'd meet other people, the random things, but then people get to know each other, talk about their concerns about this, who has kids, who doesn't, who has what job, who's unemployed, all this stuff. And so when the time came when there was a threat, they were all kind of coming together to say, okay, what do we need? Diapers, food. There's a hospital down the road, delivery. Who has some guns because they needed to protect. So all these things were happening because people had some connectedness, knew each other. So there's that very, very, very hyper local infrastructure. There's also infrastructure that's important on all kinds of other levels.
Sure. There's been some discussion in the panels throughout the day about business cases and how one needs to make the argument for investment when speaking to funders. And all three of you are in a position where, to varying degrees, you make decisions on where to invest. And, I'm on the side of, I'm constantly making the argument why someone should invest in my cause. And it immediately leads to impact. But when it comes to disaster recovery, you invest in it, and unfortunately, inevitably, there's going to be another disaster after that. So what are some examples that any of you have seen examples of quantifying the impact of your particular investments in disaster recovery or crisis scenarios? How do you measure that investment that your organization makes in the aftermath of a disaster?
I'll give you one very specific example. So we did research last year looking at, can you quantify the benefits of resilience? And what we found was that for every $13 that you invest in community resilience, for every $1 you spend in community resilience, you save $13 in response costs. You can't argue with that. So when a local chamber of commerce, every town in America has one, goes in and says we actually need to be more resilient, and they can put that on the table, you can't argue with that. I do think that we do run a risk, though, that sometimes we try and over-quantify things. It's really hard. When Nick was talking, I was thinking about a story I heard right after Russia invaded Ukraine. All of the prognosticators here in Washington knew what was going to happen. Of course, they were all wrong. Ukraine still stands. But there was a company that was asked to help ensure that Ukraine would remain a country, even if it didn't have physical control of its territory, by storing and preserving all of its administrative and written records. So they went and they pulled all of the pension data, the land records, all the things that you need for your society to persist. And they put it on hard drives into these hard plastic cases, and they got it out of the country. They were able to do that because people knew each other. So we could talk about how it's really important that you know each other at the local level. It is just as important at the national level. I worked very intensively on COVID. The biggest indicator of success, the thing that, and I couldn't quantify it, was whether or not people knew each other or could build trust quickly. Because the people from government speak one language, the people from private sector speak one language, and the people from the nonprofits or the communities speak a language. And then when you get into government, you've got the Fed speaking a language, the state speaking a language, the international organizations speaking a language. Hard to quantify. But you can tell when it's not there. And it's the absence of that that is the thing that's the hardest to show, but maybe the biggest indicator.
Others on measuring impact.
Well, I wanted to I'll kind of answer your question, but might go a little different. You know, because we're talking about disasters and crisis and oriented, you know, some might argue right now we're in crisis all the time, poly-crisis, meta-crisis. You know, there are one-time events like fires that because of climate change will be likely to repeat more and all that. But there's also things that just continue to happen. And having civic or social infrastructure is, you got to have it there just in case, right? And I think the dilemma is that in philanthropy, we've fallen into this kind of trap very often of there's a problem, needs a solution, right? There's a problem, you put a bunch of money into it, you program it and all that, and you know, you do things for a few years and then problem solved. Well, it doesn't work that way for infrastructure. You have to be there just in case, and then that leads to the dilemma of like, okay, we're supposed to show results, we're supposed to show that the investment was worthwhile. How do we do that, right? When we're trying to make sure that that something's in place for the just in case, right? Or some things that you can't really prove. I remember I was at a workshop of the State Association of Nonprofits talking about their policy people, how they do policy work, and one of them said, 90% of my work is making sure that bad ideas that some legislator thought was a good idea don't happen, right? So, you know, how do you measure that? You don't. But I will say that here's by far the best case that I have seen for why infrastructure for the nonprofit sector in the U.S. was important, and that was during COVID-19. I still think, maybe some of you know others, but I think it's the biggest policy win that there has been for the nonprofit sector that I know of, and that is when they were putting together the Paycheck Protection Program, the PPP forgivable loans, and initially it was about small businesses. Nonprofits were not written into the legislation. And then organizations, I think National Council of Nonprofits led the charge, but independent sector and others like raised the hue and cry. But they also already existed. They had organizational infrastructure. They had connections. So they were able to make the case that nonprofits should be in this as well. And as a result, there were some $50 billion in forgivable loans given to nonprofits, protecting 6.2 million jobs. Something like 40% of eligible nonprofits were able to stay afloat during that tough time, right? So infrastructure is not a problem to be solved, okay, now we can go live happily ever after. It needs constant maintenance, expansion, shoring up, and the like. And sadly, you can't always, quantify the result there. That's, to Mark's point.
Yeah, I find that is a symptom of actually even doing democracy work. Civic infrastructure in terms of voting is often treated as disaster recovery. What is the election that you're trying to win? Let's marshal resources at the 11th hour without building that long-term infrastructure that fosters engagement that can be lasting cycle over cycle. But I imagine that whether you're a program officer or you're leading a foundation that's collecting funds from a pooled group of persons, or you're leading a business cooperative or a membership organization, you have to make an argument for why resources should be placed in this rather than that. So what are your thoughts on how can funders shift from this short-term outlook and making short-term investments to the disasters after they've already happened to the long-term infrastructure investments, whether it's around information, community building, whatever it is, how do you move your constituents to understand the value of long-term versus treating that symptom instead of the illness?
Now that I have the new mic,
Yeah.
it's very powerful here. I think part of it is defining what infrastructure, how you can plug into infrastructure in your respective organizations' ways. So the way that we think about infrastructure and the way that we plug into infrastructure is we'll partner with the public sector. So we'll partner with government. In fact, I know Kumar was up here earlier, and I met Kumar years ago when he was with the OSTP at the White House with the Obama administration, and we had fellows in the White House who were working on access to capital, and so we were working with the public sector, and I think philanthropy can use this as a great tool to insert innovation in government. And so we've done that in Los Angeles, where we've helped build the social infrastructure by partnering with the Department of Transportation and working on a mobility study that included autonomous vehicles and public transportation. We've also worked on the Olympics and providing sort of a volunteer legacy scaffolding so that once the Olympics come and go from Los Angeles, there will be something there that will be durable and lasting. And then the other way that we think about infrastructure is we think about solutions that don't even exist yet. So we are very nimble funders. We're seed funders. We are also not the largest foundation in the world. So we recognize our role is that we can help de-risk a strategy that a larger foundation or a larger funder or a government can come in and support later. So one of the things that we've done is in 2019, we started thinking about AI and how AI was going to impact the communities we serve and the organizations we support. And we are now training, in 2025, training hundreds of organizations that are our grantees and that are our portfolio companies in AI. We have an AI executive in residence. We surveyed hundreds of organizations we work with, and we've built that training and that social infrastructure within the capacity of the organizations. We had OpenAI came to Los Angeles to do a regional training convening with their OpenAI Academy, where they're now giving, I think it's a $50 million fund, and they came to us to be their partner because they knew we'd already built that social infrastructure. And so when I look at the organizations who are doing the work around housing and education and public safety and environmental sustainability and arts and cultural vitality and social connectedness and all of the things that we all care about and that LA 2050 stands for, I look at how the technology and the training that we're providing cannot just assist with an operation or with a strategy, but it can help embed adaptation and future-proofing in an organization and therefore in an entire industry.
Mike, you got anything on long-term versus short-term and making the case to stakeholders?
It's really, really, really hard. There's no shortage of short-term challenges. And, you know, where we operate, because we're not a grant-making foundation, where we operate is we're always trying to anticipate the problem that needs to be solved several years into the future, which is a really fun and exciting place to be, and sometimes terrifying, but also really hard to pay for. Because it's really easy to get someone to focus on the problem that's right in front of you. It's far more challenging to explain this is something that we can prevent or mitigate or shape if we get ahead of it. So what we're finding is that a lot of our work it's actually this same core principles. It doesn't matter if it's our civics work, if it's our disaster work, if it's any myriad other, we're doing some national security stuff. It all comes down to some really core precepts, which is how do we bring people together? How do we foster trust? How do we enable communication? And how do we promote really kind of basic structures of information sharing, of decision making, of identifying those shared values that, you know, there's a theme across all these different things. Finding that problem, it's often a problem, that unites us in common action. And so when short-term is easier to fund and it's easier to mobilize people on, like during COVID, had no problem. Like what I say is, so in December of 2019, you would have struggled to find a company that had pandemic in its top 10 things. In June of 2020, you'd struggle to find a company that did not have it as their number 1, 2, and 3 issue. Today, you would probably struggle to find companies that have pandemic in their top 10 again, because the immediacy of the threat has abated, and you've seen this growth of, the poly crisis. There are many, many other things that demand our attention today. So we think that falling back on really kind of fundamental structural infrastructure of decision-making, not hard infrastructure, but the things that allow you to make better decisions and to be nimble enough to adjust on the fly, because you've built the capacity to deal with this problem, you can apply it to that problem.
Do you want to jump in here?
I'll just say that I think about a decade ago, I remember that in the foundation world and in the nonprofit sector world, there was like a campaign to invest 1% in organizational infrastructure for the sector, and they weren't making it. I'm proud to say that was a while back. Last time I counted, I think we were at about 4% at the Mott Foundation. But there's this dilemma of just focusing and looking at the short-term needs, and I think some of that was born out of this kind of being very rational, focused, impact. I'll never forget when a former president of the Ford Foundation, Susan Beresford, after she retired, I heard her at some conference bemoaning that the sector now has OMD, obsessive measurement disorder, right? Right. But no, we all need measures, we all need rigor. So I think it's a question of trying to figure out how do we assess that we're actually on the right track. I love the Civic Health Index idea because it measures not just like strict outcomes, but relationships, the strength of relationships and connections. And I think the field still has a ways to go to integrate that. I love that the civic engagement work and the nonprofit world are starting to talk more to each other. You got things like Matt Leininger, I don't know if he's here now, they're working on various ways to be able to measure it better. But so if I had to encourage other funders, because I'd been trying to do that for a long time, my peers, and saying why it's important. Some get it, some kind of, well, maybe, or they'll say my board, they just want that we can say that X number of people now have this or do that, what have you. But it's just like, if you can, have a car, you build a car, but if there's no road under the car, then it's going to fall apart pretty quickly, right? So, so I would encourage funders to think of providing flexible funding. I mean, this is old stuff that everybody keeps hearing: multi-year funding and flexible funding, general operating support as much as possible, right? And then do it for a long time. I looked at a list real quickly. We've been supporting the Council on Foundations for over 50 years, Candid for over 50 years, National Council on Nonprofits, 35 years, CF Leads even, who we heard this morning. Our first grant for their general purposes grant was in 2007 for their community leadership work for community foundations. Back before then, they were the Council on Community Foundations for Youth or something like that, and there was support before that as well. But I'm not kind of bragging on behalf of my institution, but I feel proud that our management and board gets the fact that you have to put whatever narrower things you want to accomplish in that broader context and help support that broader context, because that will really then make what you specifically want to happen that much more successful.
So a final question, a big question for a rapid round, because I want to make sure that we leave time for Q&A. How do you assess what is actually a problem that requires solving right now? when most of the issues in this country are framed nationally and somewhat divorced from what's happening at a local level? And also the metrics. How do you know what's effective when the national conversation says that this isn't working, but at the local level, it may very well be? It's an information asymmetry, and I'm wondering as funders, how you pick your investments or make your bets based on available information. You've got the national message, and then you've got what's going on the ground.
It's a good question. We take big bets, and if they're not working, we end them, which is really hard to do. But we've designed ourselves to be innovative. We have a little incubator where we try things out, and we increase our investment in terms of time and resources based on what we think the impact is going to be. And oftentimes it comes down to lives and livelihoods, really simple beginning metric. But then we also know where we have a differentiated value proposition. So, we have access to most industry sectors. We have a long tradition of sitting in between or among nonprofits, government, and companies. And then we have an existing network of local chambers of commerce. So like the way we decide is it going to have a material impact? We don't just do things to do it. Are we uniquely positioned? If not, maybe someone else should do it. And then 3, did our hypothesis actually begin to work? Because that's where it's like, oh, this was a great idea, but it didn't actually work. And you could waste a lot of time chasing the wrong theory. So we shut it down.
We've got microphones. We've got folks that have ideas up here, a lot of positions that are in community with a number of very interesting sectors. I know that Mike doesn't want to really talk about the role of business and how it's showing up, but I said that I would allow it to be open season on questioning how businesses are showing up in this moment in this country. But yeah, the floor is out there.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Sarah Isley-Durley from the CT Data Collaborative. Nick, something you said just kind of triggered a question in my mind about social media. You talked about democracy. There was a wave where there was a wave toward democracies and then a wave kind of against it as pro-democracy shared lessons, so did the anti-democracy. And I just wondered, did that spread faster because of social media? And just kind of generally, when it comes to community resilience, like how do we counter that strong kind of primal instinct that seems to rise through social media to help our communities be resilient? Is there something we can do preventatively, or do we have to think, how do we plan to counter things by being the trusted voices that people can turn to for information? I mean, how do we think about social media and the scale of that challenge when we're trying to create resilient communities that can deal with disasters that will come our way?
Well, I'll just start by saying I'm by no means a kind of expert in that area. We have other staff that are but I will say this, that and it's fascinating conversations we had yesterday yesterday evening in a salon, and the matter is that if you have spaces, including physical spaces, where people can come together and even at random, if you will, and have the opportunity to just chat, get to know each other, find their commonality where they have, then you're increasing the chances of overcoming the noise that's coming from the national or outside level that's trying to polarize and tribalize us. And the like. And in fact, a preview of a program that we're about to launch in 2026 at the Mott Foundation, that is supporting building common ground in communities on the local level but doing it with and through our favorite institutions, because we've been supporting this idea of local philanthropic infrastructure for over half a century, and so community foundations. And the way we are, we're still getting our language right, but the way we're defining that is intentionally bringing people together across divides to work on work on what they find to be shared priorities. And then hopefully that embeds itself into the culture of the community so that people will want to do that over and over again, not just to solve that one problem. I really wanted to sense something about your last question and say to the point is that we don't assess what the problem is in a community anywhere else than Flint, Michigan. Our CEO loves to say, yeah, we support communities around the world, but the only community we really know is Flint, right? And for the others, we have to be humble and say, we need some local partners and people who live there to tell us what's going on. So our kind of default is community foundation, because I mentioned before the institutions we know, right? In Flint, our people who work on our Flint programming have relationships. They also rely on data, which is very important. And not only data on like hard data of, what's the housing stock, or what's the educational attainment levels, or, the health indicators alike, but people's perceptions of things too, which don't always match things. And that's very real and important as well, right? So I encourage you, if you do things, if you're thinking nationally or want to get to scale and all that, but find those local partners of the people who are, proximity is important. We heard that earlier today. And that then you have a partner through which you can work. So you do things in LA, you're local. That's not to say I would love for your foundation to invest in things in Flint, Michigan, but you're there, and so you're so well placed to be able to know what's going on in your city, in your community. And it would be a little bit inappropriate if we were to come in and say, okay, we know what their problem is, and we'll try to solve it for them.
Can I just address a little bit with the social media? So one thing that we do is we support journalism. And so we're involved with ProPublica, Columbia Journalism School, Cal Matters, a number of different journalists, because we believe that is one of the last bastions for civic dialogue, and we'll see what happens with that. But I also think, because we do tend to use a lot of social media and technology tools in the work, our grants challenge, LA 2050, is an online crowdsourced grants challenge. And we sometimes talk about an apathy or a disengagement in communities, and we say if you can actually make the engagement tools have a feedback loop of communication, be engaging, transparent, and immediate, then you're going to get the engagement. We need to build better tools that capitalize on engaging people, because the apathy is not there. So, to the point with social media, we also use social media a lot within the Goldhurst Foundation and LA 2050 to engage our communities and to provide trusted information, to spread information about events, about jobs, whatnot. We have an online newsletter that has like way above industry average open rates, because we have established this trust and because we're sourcing content from the community. So I would say that might be a good tool for you to use, because there's no counteracting all of the immense powers that are out there that confront us. And the only way to cut through the noise is to maybe start small with the community that you trust and aggregate and source from those respective communities and bubble that up. And I think technology can really be a powerful tool for small organizations and small communities.
So I'm not sure if it's still raining and whether the beer is cold, but I'm going to kick it back to Cam with our appreciation for lending your ear. And thank you, our panelists. Yeah.
That's the conclusion of our program today. I just want to have a big round of applause for all of our participants, all of our sponsors, and all of you. We thank you so much for your engagement all day. The conference is vibrant because of all of you. We'd like to show you our appreciation now by inviting you upstairs, the 4th floor, for reception. Thank you so much.